On their wedding night, Tristan Montgomery expected duty. Ivy Caldwell expected pain. What neither of them expected was the moment he would see the scars she hid beneath silk and lace, marks that told a story no one had ever cared to read. In that cold, silent room, something shifted. A question hung in the air like smoke. Could a marriage built on obligation become something neither of them dared to hope for? This is where their story begins. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member for early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was truly worth listening to, please also click the Super Thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing stories that move people. The scent of white roses filled the cathedral, thick and cloying, almost suffocating in its perfection. Tristan Montgomery stood before the altar, his jaw tight, shoulders rigid beneath the black-tailored suit that cost more than most men earned in a year. Stained glass windows cast fractured colors across the stone floor, crimson, sapphire, gold, but none of it touched the coldness hanging in the air. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of silk dresses and the hushed murmur of guests watching with curious, judging eyes. Ivy Caldwell walked down the center aisle with measured steps, each movement calculated to hide the trembling that threatened to overtake her legs. The wedding dress, a masterpiece of French lace and hand-embroidered pearls, weighed on her shoulders like armor she hadn't chosen to wear. The fabric brushed her skin with a softness that brutally contrasted with the harshness of what this day represented. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, not looking at the familiar faces watching her, faces that knew, had always known, but had never asked. Her father, Senator Caldwell, walked beside her with the upright posture of a man accustomed to negotiating lives as if they were stocks on the trading floor. He didn't look at her. He never looked. To him, Ivy was just another piece on his political chessboard, a bargaining chip to secure an alliance with the powerful Montgomery family. And she had learned over the years not to expect anything different from him. When Ivy finally reached the altar, and her eyes met Tristan's for the first time that day, she saw something she didn't expect. Emptiness. Not contempt, not desire, not curiosity, just a deep emptiness, as if he too were there serving a sentence he hadn't chosen. She swallowed hard, tasting the bitter rise of bile in her throat. The ceremony was flawless. Each word spoken by the priest echoed through the ancient cathedral walls, with a solemnity that seemed to mock the farce everyone was witnessing. Tristan repeated his vows with a steady voice, but without emotion. Ivy did the same, her voice coming out weaker than she intended, almost a whisper that got lost among the dark wooden pews. When the priest announced that Tristan could kiss the bride, there was a pause. 1 second, 2, 3. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Tristan leaned in, his lips briefly touching Ivy's forehead, not her mouth. A gesture that might have seemed tender to those watching from afar, but to her was just another confirmation. He didn't want her, and she couldn't blame him for it. Polite applause from the guests filled the space as they turned to walk back down the aisle, now as husband and wife. Tristan's hand rested lightly on hers, but there was no warmth in the touch. It was just protocol, just appearances. The ride to Montgomery Hall was a silent torture. Inside the luxurious carriage, lined with burgundy velvet and decorated with gold details, Ivy sat as far as possible from Tristan, her body pressed against the door, as if she wanted to merge with the wood and disappear. The sound of horses' hooves against the pavement was the only noise besides their restrained breathing. Tristan looked out the window, watching the streets of London pass in a blur of Victorian buildings and lit lampposts. He could feel the tension radiating from Ivy like heat waves on a summer day, but didn't know what to say. What do you say to a woman you just married out of obligation? A woman whose name he barely knew until 3 weeks ago, when his father announced the arrangement between the families. "Are you cold?" Tristan finally asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Ivy flinched as if pulled from deep, disturbing thoughts. She slowly turned her face toward him, her eyes, a brown so dark they seemed almost black in the dim light of the carriage, meeting his for a brief moment before looking away again. "No," she answered, her voice barely audible. A lie. She was shaking, and they both knew it. Tristan removed his coat and extended it to her, a simple gesture that seemed to carry more weight than it should. Ivy hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air for a moment, before finally accepting the garment. She wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the residual warmth of his body embedded in the fabric, along with a scent of cedar and something she couldn't identify. Something deeply masculine and unsettling. "Thank you," she murmured. The silence returned to envelop them, denser now, loaded with unspoken things. When they finally arrived at Montgomery Hall, Ivy had to suppress a gasp at the sight of the imposing mansion rising before her. It was a majestic structure, with 3 stories of grey stone and enormous windows, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Perfectly manicured gardens stretched in all directions, and a marble fountain spouted crystal-clear water in the center of the circular path leading to the main entrance. It was beautiful and terrifying. Tristan descended first and extended his hand to help her. Ivy accepted, her fingers touching his out of necessity, not choice. When her feet touched the stone ground, she felt her legs almost give way but forced herself to remain upright. She couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. The staff was lined up at the entrance, faces polite and professional, all greeting the new couple with bows and restrained smiles. Ivy could barely register their faces. Everything seemed blurred, distant, as if she were watching the scene through a veil of water. "I'll show you to your quarters," Tristan said, his voice formal, almost impersonal. Ivy just nodded. They climbed the grand marble staircase, their steps echoing in the vast, silent hall. Portraits of Montgomery ancestors watched from above with stern expressions, as if judging her every move. Ivy kept her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at those dead faces that seemed to know all her secrets. When they reached the 3rd floor, Tristan stopped before a double door of dark oak. He opened it, revealing a spacious and elegantly decorated room. A canopy bed dominated the center of the space, covered with white silk sheets and embroidered pillows. A lit fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with wallpaper in ivory and gold tones. "This is your room," Tristan said, and Ivy noticed something important in those words. Your room. Not our room. "And yours?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Down the hall," he replied, gesturing vaguely to the left. "You don't need to worry, I won't bother you tonight." Ivy felt a relief so intense it almost made her stagger, but along with the relief came something else, a pang of something she couldn't name. Humiliation, gratitude, confusion. "You don't have to love me," Tristan said then, his voice low and firm, blue eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe for a second. "But I demand honesty." Ivy blinked, processing those words. Honesty. What kind of honesty did he expect from her when she had spent her entire life hiding who she really was? "I understand," she finally said, though she wasn't sure she understood anything at all. Tristan nodded, took a step back, and without another word turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Ivy stood in the middle of the room, alone for the first time since she had woken that morning. The silence was deafening. Slowly she walked to the window and looked down at the gardens below, now bathed in the silvery light of the moon beginning to rise on the horizon. She was a wife now, but she didn't feel like one. She felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. And the night she feared more than anything, was still to come. Night had fallen completely over Montgomery Hall, and with it came a heavy silence that seemed to suck all the air from Ivy's room. She stood before the full-length mirror, her hands trembling as she held the hem of the wedding dress she still wore. The golden light from candles scattered throughout the room created shadows that danced on the walls, making the room feel smaller, more suffocating. A soft knock on the door made her flinch. "Milady, may I help you change?" Martha's gentle voice, the personal maid who had been assigned to her, came from the hallway. "No," Ivy answered too quickly, her voice coming out harsher than she intended. "Thank you, Martha. I can manage on my own." There was a pause on the other side of the door, and Ivy could imagine the maid's confused expression. What kind of bride dismissed help on her wedding night? But Martha, trained in the discretion expected of servants in great houses, simply responded, "As you wish, milady. I'll be in the hallway should you need me." Ivy waited until she heard the footsteps fade before releasing the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands returned to the dress, and with mechanical movements, she began unbuttoning the endless row of tiny pearl buttons running down the back. Each button that came loose felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders, but also brought her closer to the moment she dreaded most. The dress finally fell in a cascade of fabric and lace at her feet, leaving her in only the white silk slip she wore underneath. It was a delicate piece, almost transparent, embroidered with tiny flowers around the neckline. It had been chosen by the seamstress as appropriate for a wedding night. Something meant to be beautiful, seductive, feminine. Ivy hated it. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, and for a moment didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the candlelight, her eyes hollow and haunted. Her dark brown hair, still pinned in the elaborate wedding updo, weighed on her head like a crown of thorns. With trembling fingers, she began removing the pins, one by one, until the long strands fell in waves over her shoulders. It was a physical relief, but it didn't ease the weight she felt in her chest, the weight of expectation, of fear, of memory. Ivy closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But then the memories came, as they always did when she was alone and vulnerable. Her father's voice, cold and cutting, the sound of the belt whistling through the air, the sharp, burning pain that made her bite her lip until it bled to keep from screaming. "You will learn to behave like a lady, Ivy, even if I have to teach you by force." She opened her eyes abruptly, pushing the memories away. No, not tonight. She couldn't fall apart now. With still trembling hands, Ivy picked up the lace nightgown that was carefully folded on the bed. Another wedding gift, more elaborate and revealing than the one she wore. She held it against her body, feeling the soft, delicate fabric between her fingers, and then let it fall back onto the bed. No, she couldn't. Instead, she walked to the wardrobe and grabbed a simple white cotton robe, slipping her arms into the sleeves and tying the belt at her waist tightly, as if that could protect her from what was to come. Ivy approached the vanity and sat down, picking up the silver brush and beginning to comb her hair with slow, methodical movements. It was an attempt to calm herself, to buy time, to postpone the inevitable. But each time the brush passed through the long strands, she felt the fabric of the robe brush against her back, and the sensation reminded her of what was hidden there. The scars, thin white and pink lines that cut across her skin in an irregular pattern. Some older and faded, others more recent and still visible. Marks from years of punishments her father called necessary corrections. Marks she hid under high-necked dresses and long sleeves, under polite smiles and well-trained silences. Marks that no one had seen, ever. A sound from the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps, firm, approaching. Ivy's heart raced, beating so hard she could feel it pulsing in her throat. She dropped the brush, her hands gripping the edges of the vanity so tightly her knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped outside her door. There was a knock. 3 soft taps, almost hesitant. "Ivy?" Tristan's voice was low but clear through the thick wooden door. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped somewhere between fear and panic. "May I come in?" he asked. Ivy closed her eyes, fighting the urge to scream, no, to lock the door, to escape through the window if necessary. But she knew there was no avoiding it. She was his wife now, and wives had duties. Her father had made that very clear before the wedding. "You will do whatever is necessary to maintain this alliance, Ivy. Don't disappoint me." "Yes," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. The door opened slowly and Tristan entered. He had changed from his formal suit into something simpler, dark trousers and a white shirt with the first buttons undone, revealing the base of his neck. His dark blonde hair, previously perfectly styled, was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it several times. There was something in his expression, a tension around his eyes, a hard line in his jaw, that suggested he was as uncomfortable as she was. Their eyes met through the mirror, and Ivy felt something strange run down her spine. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more complex, more confusing. Tristan closed the door behind him, but didn't step beyond it. He stood there, hands in his pockets, as if he didn't know what to do with them. "I didn't come for..." "For what you're thinking," he finally said, his voice careful, measured. Ivy turned in the chair to face him directly, confusion briefly replacing fear. "Then why did you come?" Tristan hesitated, his blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to hide. "Because I thought we should talk, like two people who are going to spend the rest of their lives together." "Talk," Ivy repeated, the word sounding strange in her mouth, almost absurd given the situation. "Yes." He took a step forward, then stopped as if approaching a frightened animal. "I know this marriage wasn't either of our choice, but we're in this now, and I'd like to try to make it bearable. For both of us. Bearable. What an interesting word. Not happy, not loving, not even pleasant. Just bearable." Ivy felt something tighten in her chest. Not disappointment, because she had never expected anything different, but perhaps a painful confirmation that she would never be more than a burden to be endured. "I understand," she said, turning back to the mirror, unable to keep looking at him. There was a long, heavy silence. Then she heard his footsteps approaching, closer, closer, until she could see his reflection behind her in the mirror, tall and imposing, a presence that dominated the space. "You're trembling," Tristan observed, his voice softer now. "I'm cold," Ivy lied, pulling the robe tighter around her body. "Ivy." The way he said her name, for the first time using just her first name, without formalities, did something strange to her stomach. "Look at me." She didn't want to, but slowly, reluctantly, she turned in the chair once more, raising her eyes to meet his. Tristan was closer than she had realized. Close enough that she could see the details she had missed during the ceremony. The small lines around his eyes, the thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking. "I promise you," he said, his voice low but firm, each word pronounced carefully, "that I will never touch you without your permission. Never. No matter what society or our families expect, you have my word." Ivy blinked, processing those words. They were so unexpected, so different from everything she had imagined, that for a moment she didn't know how to respond. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Tristan held her gaze, and there was something in his eyes, something that seemed honest, real. "Because I saw the way you looked at me at the altar, and I recognized that expression." "What expression?" "Fear." The word hung in the air between them like a confession. Ivy felt tears burn her eyes but forced herself not to shed them. She couldn't cry, not in front of him, not in front of anyone. But then something happened, something that changed everything. The knot of her robe, hastily tied in her rush and nervousness, began to come loose. Ivy realized a second too late, her hands flying to hold the fabric, but not before the robe opened partially, slipping from one of her shoulders and exposing the scars. The air was sucked from the room. Tristan froze, his eyes fixed on her bare shoulder, on the white and pink lines cutting across her pale skin like whip marks, because that's exactly what they were. Ivy pulled the robe back forcefully, covering herself again, her face burning with shame and horror. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't look." But Tristan had already seen, and the expression on his face, the way his features hardened, how his eyes darkened, how his jaw clenched until a muscle pulsed there, said he understood exactly what those marks meant. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and his voice was filled with something Ivy had never heard before, a deep, visceral anger, contained only by a thread of control. Ivy shook her head, unable to speak, tears finally escaping and running down her cheeks. "Ivy," Tristan said again, and this time there was urgency in his voice. "Who did this to you?" But she couldn't answer, couldn't force the words out, because admitting it out loud would make it all too real, too painful. Tristan knelt before her, placing himself at eye level, and the gesture was so unexpected that Ivy stopped breathing. "You don't have to tell me now," he said softly, his voice completely different from the furious tone of moments before. "But I promise you, Ivy Caldwell Montgomery, that no one will hurt you again. Not while I breathe." And for the first time since she'd met him, Ivy saw something in Tristan Montgomery she hadn't expected to see. Sincerity. The silence that followed Tristan's promise was thick, loaded with emotions neither of them knew how to name. Ivy remained seated in the vanity chair, tears still wet on her cheeks, the robe firmly tied around her body as if that piece of fabric could protect her from all the vulnerability she had just exposed. Tristan was still kneeling before her, his blue eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that seemed to penetrate every layer of defense she had built over the years. "I don't know what to say," Ivy finally whispered, her voice hoarse from held-back tears. "You don't have to say anything," Tristan replied, rising slowly. He extended his hand, hesitant, as if asking silent permission before touching any part of her. "May I?" Ivy looked at the outstretched hand, confused. "May you what?" "Help you stand. The bed would be more comfortable than this chair." It was a simple gesture, almost mundane, but there was something about it that unsettled Ivy. He was asking. Not demanding, not assuming, but asking, as if the choice were hers. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Tristan's palm was warm, calloused in some spots, hands of someone who knew physical work, not just luxury. He helped her stand carefully, as if she were something fragile that could break with too much pressure. When Ivy was standing, she realized how close they were, close enough to feel the warmth emanating from his body, to catch the scent of cedar and something slightly musky that seemed to permeate his skin. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was something more confusing, more unsettling. "Sit down," Tristan said gently, indicating the bed with a gesture. Ivy obeyed, sitting on the edge of the soft mattress, her hands clasped in her lap. She expected him to sit beside her, to try something, anything she had been taught to expect from a husband on the wedding night. But instead, Tristan walked to the armchair near the fireplace and sat there, maintaining a respectful distance between them. The action was so unexpected that Ivy looked up in surprise. "I'm not going to touch you tonight," Tristan said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not tomorrow, not any day until you ask me to." "Ask you to," Ivy repeated, the words sounding absurd. Husbands don't ask permission from their wives. This husband does. There was a firmness in his voice that allowed no argument. "You are my wife, Ivy, but you're not my property. You have a voice, you have a choice, and I'm going to respect that." Ivy stared at him, searching for signs of falsehood, of some trap hidden in those pretty words. But all she saw was sincerity, and that frightened her almost as much as the prospect of being forced. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you being kind?" Tristan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. For a long moment he didn't answer, just looked at the crackling fire in the fireplace, the flames dancing reflected in his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be forced to do something against your will," he finally said, his voice low. "I know what it's like to have every decision in your life made by someone else, and I swore to myself that if I ever had power over someone's life, I would never use that power to cause pain." There was something in his words, a layer of personal experience, of old suffering, that made Ivy realize Tristan Montgomery wasn't just the privileged heir she had imagined. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. Tristan raised his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment Ivy thought he would shut down, refuse to answer. But then he let out a long, weary sigh. "My father," he said simply, "Duke Edward Montgomery, a brilliant businessman admired by society, feared by his enemies." He paused, his jaw tightening, and a tyrant within his own home. Ivy felt something tighten in her chest. She knew that kind of man. She had grown up with one. "He never hit me," Tristan continued, his voice taking on a bitter tone. "Not physically, at least. But there were other forms of punishment. Isolation, public humiliation, absolute control over every aspect of my life. Every friendship I tried to make was examined and often destroyed. Every interest I developed was ridiculed if it didn't align with his expectations." He let out a humorless laugh. "I learned early that being a Montgomery meant being a piece on someone else's chessboard. And this marriage," Ivy said slowly, understanding dawning, "was also his decision." "Yes," Tristan nodded. 3 weeks before the wedding, he called me to his office and informed me I would marry Senator Caldwell's daughter. It wasn't a question, it was an order. And when I tried to argue, he made it very clear that if I refused, He would cut off my access to any family resources and disinherit me completely. So you were forced too, Ivy whispered. Yes, he held her gaze, but I choose how I'm going to live this marriage. And I choose not to perpetuate the cycle of control and abuse my father built. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ivy felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the wall of fear and distrust she had built. This man, this stranger who was now her husband, understood. He truly understood. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be free. Neither do I, Tristan said with a small, sad smile. But maybe we can learn together. Ivy nodded slowly, absorbing that idea. Learn together, as if they were partners, not just people trapped in a contract. There's something else I'd like to propose, Tristan said, rising from the armchair and walking to the writing desk near the window. He opened a drawer and took out a sheet of paper and a pen. An agreement. Between us. Just between us. What kind of agreement? Ivy asked, watching him return and sit at the foot of the bed, keeping his distance but closer than before. Rules, he explained, placing the paper between them. Not society's rules or our family's rules, but our own rules, about how we're going to live this life together. Ivy looked at the blank paper, feeling something strange stir in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or just the possibility of it. What do you suggest? She asked. Tristan picked up the pen. First, complete autonomy. You have the freedom to go where you want, do what you want as long as it's safe. I'm not your guardian. He wrote with firm, clear handwriting. Ivy watched the words take shape on the paper, each letter seeming like a small revolution. Second, he continued, privacy. Your quarters are yours, I won't enter without permission. And you have the same courtesy regarding mine. More words on paper. Ivy felt a lump form in her throat. Third, honesty. If something's wrong, if you need something, if you're afraid, tell me, I'll do the same. Fourth, he paused, raising his eyes to meet hers. Consent. In everything. Always. Ivy blinked rapidly, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall again. No one had ever offered her this. No one had ever treated her needs, her desires, her fears as if they mattered. Do you agree to these terms? Tristan asked softly. Yes, she whispered. But can I add something? Of course. Ivy extended her hand hesitantly, and Tristan handed her the pen. With trembling fingers, she wrote below his rules. Fifth, no lies about the past. If we ask, we answer truthfully. When she finished, she raised her eyes to Tristan. I don't want secrets between us, not the kind that hurt. Tristan read what she had written and nodded slowly. Agreed. He signed his name at the bottom of the paper with an elegant flourish, then handed the pen to Ivy. She looked at her own signature for a long moment, before finally writing her name, Ivy Caldwell Montgomery, the letters trembling slightly, but steady. When she finished, Tristan took the paper and folded it carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. This is our agreement, he said, just ours. No one else needs to know, but we'll know, and that's what matters. Ivy nodded, feeling something warm and strange expand in her chest. It wasn't love. She didn't even know what real love was. But it was something, maybe respect, maybe gratitude, maybe just the smallest spark of hope. Tristan stood up, walking toward the door. But before leaving, he stopped, turning to look at her one last time. The candlelight illuminated his profile, creating shadows that made his face softer, more human. You're not invisible to me, Ivy, he said, his voice low but clear in the quiet of the room. Nor insignificant. I see you, and I'm going to keep seeing you. Before Ivy could respond, before she could process the weight of those words, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Ivy sat on the bed, alone once more, but this time the silence didn't feel as suffocating. She looked at the closed door, her hands still trembling slightly, her heart beating in an irregular rhythm. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and hadn't looked away, and that changed everything. The days following the wedding night brought a strange and unexpected routine for Ivy. She would wake with the sun streaming through the velvet curtains, the room bathed in golden light, and for a few seconds she would forget where she was. Then reality would return. She was a wife now, living at Montgomery Hall, trapped in an arranged marriage with a man she barely knew, but a man who had promised to respect her autonomy. And to her surprise, Tristan was keeping his word. On the first morning, Ivy came down for breakfast expecting cold formality and awkward silence. Instead, she found the dining room table elegantly set, but not overly formal. There were fresh flowers, not dramatic red roses as one might expect, but lavender and white peonies in a simple, beautiful arrangement that gave off a soft, comforting fragrance. Tristan was already seated, reading the morning paper, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. When Ivy entered, he looked up and stood immediately, a gesture of chivalry that surprised her. "Good morning," he said, his voice still formal, but there was something softer in it than before. "I hope you slept well." "Yes, thank you," Ivy lied. In truth, she had spent most of the night awake, replaying every word of their conversation, every promise he had made, searching for hidden traps she might have missed. But by morning, with sunlight illuminating the room and no sign of Tristan forcing his way in, she had begun to consider the impossible possibility that perhaps he was sincere. Tristan pulled out the chair for her, and Ivy sat down, feeling his gaze linger a second longer than necessary before returning to his own seat. Breakfast was served by silent, efficient staff. Eggs, toast, fresh fruit, homemade preserves. Ivy ate little, still uncomfortable under Tristan's occasional gaze, who pretended to read the paper, but whose eyes drifted to her with a frequency she couldn't ignore. "Do you like to read?" Tristan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ivy looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes, very much. The library here is extensive. You're welcome to use it as you wish. In fact," he hesitated, setting the paper aside, "I'd like you to consider Montgomery Hall as your home. Not just a place where you're staying." The word home sounded strange to Ivy's ears. She had never had a real home, just places where she existed, where she tried to make herself invisible to avoid her father's attention. "Thank you," she said softly. In the days that followed, Ivy began to explore the mansion. It was an immense place, full of hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, rooms that hadn't been used in years, and secret staircases that led to unexpected places. But what fascinated her most was the library. It was a two-story room with dark mahogany shelves that went from floor to ceiling, accessed by rolling ladders of polished brass. There were thousands of books, classics, novels, philosophy, science, poetry, organized with meticulous care. Tall windows let in natural light that illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Ivy spent hours there, lost among pages and worlds that weren't her own. It was her refuge, her sanctuary. Until on a Thursday afternoon she realized she wasn't alone. She was standing on one of the rolling ladders, stretching to reach a book on the highest shelf, an old copy of Jane Eyre that had captured her attention. Her fingers brushed the leather spine but couldn't grasp it properly. She stretched further, rising on her tiptoes, her balance becoming precarious. "Careful," a deep voice said behind her, and suddenly there were hands on her waist, firm and warm, steadying her. Ivy gasped, her heart racing not just from the fright, but from the sensation of those hands touching her through the thin fabric of her blue muslin dress. She looked down and found Tristan right below her, his large hands encircling her waist with a delicacy that contrasted with their obvious strength. I was just trying to reach the book," she managed to say, her voice coming out more breathless than she intended. "I saw," Tristan said, and there was something in his voice, a deeper tone, almost husky. "But this ladder isn't as stable as it looks. You could have fallen." He helped her down slowly, his hands remaining on her waist throughout, and Ivy felt every inch of the descent with an acute awareness that disturbed her. When her feet finally touched solid ground, she expected him to step away. He didn't step away. Instead, they stood there, much closer than they should be, his hands still resting lightly on her waist, as if he had forgotten to release her, or perhaps didn't want to. Ivy raised her eyes slowly and found his gaze already fixed on her face. Their faces were inches apart. So close she could see the small golden flecks in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath brushing her forehead, could catch the scent of cedar and something slightly minty coming from him. "You smell like lavender," Tristan murmured, his voice low, almost intimate, his eyes briefly dropping to her lips before returning to hers. Ivy's heart was beating so hard, she was certain he could hear it. There was something in the air between them, an electric tension, an invisible current that both pulled and repelled at the same time. "And you smell like danger," she responded before she could stop herself, the words coming out in a breathless whisper that revealed far more than she intended. Tristan's lips curved into a half smile, not of amusement, but of something darker, more intense. "Danger?" he repeated, his voice still low, one hand moving slightly on her waist, his thumb tracing a small circle through the fabric that sent shivers down her spine. "Yes," Ivy whispered, unable to look away. "You're unsettling." "Unsettling." Tristan tested the word, and there was definitely amusement now, mixed with something that seemed like satisfaction. Interesting. They remained like this for another long moment, so close that it would take only a slight lean to close the distance between their lips. Ivy could feel temptation pulsing through her, a strange and frightening curiosity about what it would be like to kiss him, to be kissed by him. But then the library door opened, and the sound of echoing footsteps made them both pull away quickly, as if they had been burned. "Sorry to interrupt, milord," Martha, the maid, said from the entrance, looking embarrassed, "but an urgent message has arrived for you, sir." Tristan cleared his throat, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Ivy was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "Thank you, Martha. I'll be there in a moment." The maid nodded and left quickly, clearly relieved to escape the palpable tension in the air. Tristan turned to Ivy again, and there was something different in his expression now, a kind of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Sorry, I didn't mean to—" "You did nothing wrong," Ivy interrupted, surprised by her own courage. "You kept me from falling. I should thank you." Still, he took a step back, creating safe distance between them. "I promised to respect your boundaries, and I will." There was something in his words, a promise but also an underlying frustration, as if respecting her was harder than he expected. "Tristan," Ivy said, testing his name on her tongue for the first time without formalities. He froze, his eyes meeting hers with surprise. "You didn't violate any promise." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with a brief nod, he turned and left, leaving Ivy alone in the library. She stood there, her heart still beating fast, her hands trembling slightly. Slowly she brought them to her waist, where his hands had been moments before, and could still feel the residual warmth through the fabric. Something had changed in that moment. Some line had been crossed, not broken but definitely crossed. And the scariest part was that Ivy wasn't sure she wanted to go back. That evening at dinner, the tension between them was palpable. They sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, but Ivy could feel his eyes on her constantly. When she looked up, she sometimes caught him staring, and he didn't look away immediately. Instead, he held her gaze for 1 second, 2, 3, before finally returning his attention to his food. "How was your day?" Tristan asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "Productive," Ivy replied, picking up her wine glass. "I finished 2 books. You're a fast reader. I always have been." "It was my escape." She hadn't meant to reveal this, but the words came out before she could stop them. Tristan tilted his head, studying her. "Escape from what?" Ivy hesitated. Rule 5 of their agreement: no lies about the past. If he asked, she should answer. "From reality," she said simply. "In books I could be anyone, be anywhere, not be me." Something passed through Tristan's eyes. Understanding, perhaps. Empathy. "I understand that," he said softly. "More than you know." Their gazes met across the table, and there was something in that moment, a silent connection, a mutual recognition of shared pain. "Ivy," Tristan said, and the way he pronounced her name sent a shiver down her spine. "You're different today." Different how? Less frightened, more present. Ivy considered this. He was right. She was different. Something in her was changing, slowly but inevitably, like ice melting under the spring sun. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "I'm just beginning to remember who I was before I learned to disappear." Tristan stood up, and for a moment Ivy thought he would leave her there alone. But instead, he walked around the table, stopping beside her chair. He extended his hand, and Ivy looked at it for a long moment before placing hers in his. He helped her stand, and suddenly they were close again, dangerously close. His hand held hers gently, but there was strength there, and warmth. "Don't disappear," Tristan said, his voice low and intense. "Not from me, please." Ivy felt tears burn her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were something different, something new. "I'll try," she whispered, and in that moment, with their hands intertwined and their hearts beating in a rapid rhythm, they both knew that something inevitable had begun. Something neither of them could control anymore. Margaret Montgomery's arrival was announced 2 days in advance, enough time for the entire staff at Montgomery Hall to enter a state of frantic preparation. Ivy watched from the top of the staircase as maids rushed back and forth, polishing silver that already gleamed, arranging fresh flowers in every room, checking and rechecking every detail. "Is she demanding?" Ivy asked Martha, who was adjusting the lily arrangement on the entrance hall table for the 3rd time. Martha looked up, surprised by the question. Then her face softened with something that seemed like sympathy. "Lady Margaret isn't demanding, milady. She's just imposing. A woman of strong presence. Imposing." The word stayed with Ivy, increasing the anxiety she already felt. She had spent the last few days in a sort of peaceful bubble with Tristan. Dinners where they talked more each night, mornings where they passed each other in the hallways and exchanged glances that lasted longer than they should, stolen moments in the library where he appeared with flimsy excuses to see her. But now the reality of the outside world was about to invade their fragile sanctuary. On the morning of Margaret's arrival, Ivy spent almost an hour choosing the right dress, changing 3 times before finally settling on an emerald green silk with cream lace details. It was elegant without being ostentatious, conservative without being dull. She pinned her hair in an elaborate bun, leaving a few loose strands framing her face, and pinched her cheeks to give them color. When she came down to the reception hall, she found Tristan already waiting, dressed impeccably in a dark grey suit that brought out his blue eyes. He turned when he heard her enter, and Ivy didn't miss the way his gaze traveled slowly over her figure, lingering in a way that made her stomach flip. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice carrying a note of sincerity that made her blush. "Thank you," Ivy murmured, nervously smoothing her dress skirt. "I'm nervous." "Don't be," Tristan said, approaching her. He extended his hand, and when Ivy took it, he gently pulled her closer. "My mother can be intimidating, but she's not cruel. And if she says something that bothers you, you tell me, immediately." Ivy nodded, feeling the warmth of his hand enveloping hers, strong and comforting. She was about to respond when they heard the sound of a carriage arriving on the drive. She had arrived. Tristan released Ivy's hand, but not before giving it a gentle, encouraging squeeze. Together they walked to the main entrance, where the staff was already lined up in welcoming formation. The doors opened, and Margaret Montgomery entered like a force of nature. She was tall and almost as tall as Tristan, with dark brown hair interspersed with silver strands pulled back in an elegant updo. Her eyes were a piercing blue, identical to her son's, but there was a hardness in them acquired through years of experience. She wore a burgundy velvet traveling dress with fur details, and every movement was measured and deliberate, exuding power and confidence. Her gaze swept the entrance hall, passing over the staff, resting briefly on Tristan, and then fixing on Ivy with an intensity that made her want to step back. But Ivy forced herself to remain steady, raising her chin slightly, meeting that penetrating gaze even when every instinct screamed at her to look away. "Mother," Tristan said, stepping forward and kissing Margaret's cheek. "Good to have you back." "Tristan," Margaret responded, her voice rich and clear, carrying natural authority. She briefly touched her son's face, a gesture that seemed more habit than affection. Then her eyes returned to Ivy. "And this must be my new daughter-in-law." It wasn't a question. Ivy stepped forward, making a graceful curtsy as she had been taught. "Lady Margaret, it's an honor to meet you." Margaret studied Ivy in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Her eyes took in every detail, the dress, the posture, the face, evaluating, measuring, judging. "Ivy Caldwell," Margaret finally said, testing the name. "Senator Caldwell's daughter." "Yes, ma'am." That was all Margaret said before turning to Tristan. "I assume tea is ready." "Of course, in the blue room." As they walked through the hallways, Ivy stayed half a step behind Margaret and Tristan, observing the interaction between mother and son. There was a formality there, a distance that seemed strange for a family. No warm embrace, no questions about how they were, just polite conversation about the journey and estate matters. The blue room was one of the mansion's most elegant spaces, with walls covered in damask wallpaper, in shades of light blue and silver, Louis XVI furniture, and huge windows overlooking the gardens. Tea was already served, an impressive selection of delicate sandwiches, cakes, cookies, and of course steaming Earl Grey tea in the finest porcelain. Margaret sat in the main armchair, Tristan in a nearby chair, and Ivy in another, feeling as if she were in a job interview rather than a family tea. "So," Margaret began, adding sugar to her tea with precise movements, "tell me about yourself, Ivy. What are your interests, your skills?" Ivy felt her throat go dry. "I like to read, and I embroider reasonably well. I play piano, though not exceptionally." "And charity? Do you participate in social work?" "I didn't have much opportunity," Ivy admitted, feeling her cheeks burn. "My father didn't approve of me going out frequently." Something passed through Margaret's eyes, a flash of something that could have been understanding or perhaps recognition. "I see," she said simply, taking a sip of tea. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Ivy picked up her own cup just to have something to do with her hands. "Mother," Tristan intervened, his voice carrying a tone of gentle warning, "Ivy has been adapting very well to Montgomery Hall. She's been a pleasant presence here." "I'm sure she has," Margaret replied, but there was something in her tone that Ivy couldn't decipher. The tea continued for a few more minutes of tense and superficial conversation before Margaret stood up. "If you'll excuse me, the journey was long, and I'd like to rest before dinner." She left the room with the same imposing presence with which she had arrived, leaving Ivy and Tristan alone. Ivy let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was intense. "She's always like this at first," Tristan said, approaching and briefly touching her shoulder. "Don't take it personally." But Ivy couldn't help feeling she had failed some invisible test. Dinner that evening was even more formal than tea. Margaret presided over the table with Tristan on one side and Ivy on the other, and the conversation flowed mainly between mother and son about estate matters, investments and politics, topics about which Ivy knew little and in which she wasn't invited to participate. She ate in silence, feeling increasingly smaller as the meal progressed. It was only when dessert was being served that Margaret turned directly to Ivy. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'd like you to accompany me to a meeting of the Committee for Aid to Disadvantaged Women. It's an organization I've chaired for 15 years. Ivy blinked, surprised. Of course, it would be an honor." "Good. We'll leave at 10 o'clock. The next morning, Ivy dressed with extra care, choosing a conservative pearl grey dress and pinning her hair more severely. When she came down, Margaret was already waiting in the carriage, her expression unreadable. The ride to central London was silent, but when they arrived at the building where the meeting would take place, Ivy was surprised. It wasn't an elegant mansion or noble hall. It was a simple building in a less privileged area of the city. Inside, there were about 20 women, some clearly from high society, others visibly from lower classes. All stood when Margaret entered, greeting her with genuine respect, not just the polite fear that usually accompanied power. The meeting was about establishing a new shelter for women who had fled abusive marriages. Ivy listened as they discussed funds, location, necessary personnel. And slowly, something inside her began to awaken. These women were doing something real, something that mattered. After the meeting, as they returned to the carriage, Margaret turned to Ivy. "You were quiet today." "I didn't know if it was appropriate to speak," Ivy admitted. Margaret stopped, turning completely to face her. "Ivy, may I ask you a direct question?" "Of course. Did your father beat you?" Ivy froze, blood draining from her face. How did she know? Margaret saw the answer in Ivy's silence. Her face softened, and for the first time, Ivy saw something genuinely human in that powerful woman. "Mine did too," Margaret said simply. "And then, my first husband. Tristan's father." Ivy felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath her feet. "Duke Edward was a monster in his own home," Margaret finished. "Never with fists, of course. Men like him are too smart to leave visible marks. But there were other ways. Isolation, control, calculated humiliation." She paused. "And occasionally, when he was certain it wouldn't leave evidence, yes, physical violence. How did you survive?" Ivy whispered. "I learned that surviving wasn't enough. I needed to live. So I started working on social causes. Helping other women gave me purpose, gave me power. And when Edward died, I swore I would use his fortune to undo some of the damage that men like him cause." Margaret placed a hand on Ivy's arm, a surprisingly gentle gesture. "You're not invisible to me, Ivy. I recognize the marks, even when they're not visible. And I'm offering you what no one offered me when I was young, an alliance, not of pity but of respect, from one surviving woman to another." Tears burned Ivy's eyes. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll have dinner with me tonight, just the two of us, and we'll talk, really talk." And that night in Margaret's private sitting room, over wine and simple food, Ivy spoke. For the first time in her life, she spoke about everything, about her father, about fear, about the scars, about feeling trapped even when the chains were invisible. And Margaret listened, really listened. When Ivy finally returned to her room late that night, she found a note slipped under her door. Tristan's handwriting. "My mother told me you had a good conversation. I'm glad. You deserve to have allies. You deserve to have everything. T." Ivy held the note against her chest, and for the first time she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than just a survivor. She could be someone who flourished. The invitation arrived 3 days after Margaret's departure, delivered in a cream paper envelope with the golden seal of London high society. Ivy held it between her fingers as if it were something poisonous, her eyes fixed on the elegantly handwritten words, "Annual Charity Ball in honor of Senator Caldwell." Her father. The name alone was enough to make her stomach turn, bringing back memories she had tried to bury deep. His voice, cold and cutting. Words that hurt as much as any physical blow. The way he looked at her as if she were a constant disappointment, a mistake he was forced to tolerate. "We don't have to go," Tristan said, watching her from the doorway of the small sitting room where she was seated. He had entered quietly, but Ivy was so absorbed in her thoughts she hadn't heard him arrive. She looked up, meeting that blue gaze that seemed to see through all her defenses. "It's an important event. Your absence would be noticed and commented on." "Let them comment," Tristan replied, entering the room and sitting in the armchair across from her. "Your peace of mind is more important than society gossip." Ivy looked at the invitation again, feeling its weight in her hands. Part of her, the part that had spent years learning to become invisible, to avoid confrontation, to simply survive, wanted to accept Tristan's offer and stay hidden in the safety of Montgomery Hall. But there was another part, a part that was growing stronger each day since she'd met Margaret, since she'd begun to see there was life beyond survival. That part wanted to go, wanted to look her father in the eyes and show him she was no longer the terrified girl he could control. "I want to go," Ivy said, and her own voice surprised her, firm, decided. Tristan studied her face for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "No," she admitted with a small, sad smile. "But I'm going anyway." Tristan's expression softened, and there was something in his eyes, pride perhaps, admiration. "Then we'll go together. And if at any moment you want to leave, we leave. No questions, no judgment." Ivy nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Having someone on her side, someone who would support her without question, was something so new, so strange, that she still didn't quite know how to handle it. On the night of the ball, Ivy spent hours preparing. Martha helped her into a midnight blue satin gown that Margaret had insisted on ordering for her. It was stunning. The neckline was modest but elegant, the waist perfectly fitted, and the skirt flowed in layers of fabric that whispered when she moved. Diamonds borrowed from Margaret sparkled at her neck and ears, catching the candlelight. When Ivy descended the staircase, she found Tristan waiting in the hall, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that stole the breath from her lungs. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parted, and for a long moment he simply looked at her as if seeing something extraordinary. "Ivy," he finally said, his voice hoarse, You're absolutely stunning." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you." Tristan approached, extending his arm, and Ivy placed her hand on his elbow, feeling the firmness of muscle beneath the expensive fabric. "Remember," he said quietly, leaning in so only she could hear, "you're not alone tonight. I'm by your side. Always." The word always echoed in her mind as they entered the carriage. The ballroom at the Westmore estate was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting light in millions of brilliant fragments. The walls were adorned with silk and gold fabrics, and an orchestra played classical music from a raised corner. Hundreds of people from high society circulated, dressed in their finest attire, laughing, talking, displaying wealth and status. Ivy felt her stomach tighten as they entered, all eyes turning to assess the newcomers. She could hear the whispers, see the curious glances directed at the young Montgomery couple, and then she saw him. Senator Caldwell stood at the center of a group of influential men, a glass of whiskey in hand, laughing at something someone had said. He was impeccably dressed, as always, his gray hair perfectly styled, his posture upright and imposing. To any outside observer, he was the image of respectability, a pillar of society. Ivy knew the truth. Her fingers tightened involuntarily on Tristan's arm, and she felt his hand cover hers, squeezing gently. "Breathe," he murmured. "You're fine. You're safe." Ivy forced air into her lungs, trying to calm the panic that threatened to consume her. She could do this. She had to do this. They circulated through the ballroom, Tristan greeting acquaintances, proudly introducing Ivy as his wife. And to her surprise, people were kind. Women greeted her warmly, men made respectful comments. No one looked at her with the contempt she was used to seeing in her father's eyes. But then, inevitably, they met. "Ah, Montgomery," Senator Caldwell's voice cut through the polite conversation like a blade. "And my dear daughter, how delightful to see you both together." Ivy turned slowly, forcing herself to raise her chin to meet his eyes. Eyes she knew so well, dark brown, cold, calculating. "Senator," Tristan replied, his voice polite but without warmth, "thank you for the invitation." Of course. Caldwell waved his hand as if dismissing the matter. Then his eyes landed on Ivy, traveling up and down her in a way that made her feel dirty. "Ivy, you look presentable tonight. I see Montgomery money buys nice dresses." The comment was calculated to humiliate, to diminish, to remind her of her place. Ivy felt the familiar wave of shame begin to rise, the old instinct to lower her eyes, to murmur an apology, to disappear. But then she felt Tristan's hand squeeze hers, a silent reminder, "You're not alone." And something inside her broke, not shattered, but broke free. "Actually, Father," Ivy said, her voice coming out stronger than she expected, "this dress was a gift from Lady Margaret Montgomery. She has excellent taste, and genuine kindness, admirable qualities." Caldwell's face hardened imperceptibly. "Kindness? How touching." "Yes," Ivy continued, feeling courage she didn't know she possessed flowing through her. "I'm discovering there are many people in the world with genuine kindness. People who see value in others without needing to diminish them first." The silence that followed was tense. The men around Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the underlying tension in the conversation. "Ivy," Caldwell said, his voice low and dangerous, a tone she knew all too well, the tone that always came before punishment. "May we talk, in private?" "No," Tristan intervened before Ivy could respond, his voice cutting like steel. Anything you have to say to my wife can be said in my presence." Caldwell turned to Tristan, his eyes glittering with barely disguised anger. "Montgomery, this is a family matter." "Ivy is my family now," Tristan interrupted, stepping forward, placing himself slightly between Ivy and her father. "And I protect my family. Fiercely." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Caldwell looked from Tristan to Ivy, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, assessing whether it was worth making a scene, worth confronting the powerful Montgomery family publicly. Apparently, he decided it wasn't. "Of course," he finally said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I forgot that newlyweds are so inseparable. Enjoy the evening." He turned and walked away, but not before Ivy saw the flash of pure fury in his eyes, a silent promise that this wasn't over. But for the first time in her life, Ivy didn't feel paralyzing fear. Yes, there was anxiety, yes, there was nervousness, but there was also something stronger: pride. She had confronted her father, had spoken back, and the sky hadn't fallen. "You're shaking," Tristan observed quietly, his hand still holding hers. "I know," Ivy whispered, "but I did it. I really did." Tristan smiled. Not a polite smile, but something genuine and warm that lit up his eyes. "You were magnificent." Before Ivy could respond, the music changed, transforming into a slow, elegant waltz. Couples began moving toward the dance floor. "Dance with me," Tristan said, not as a question, but as an urgent invitation. Ivy looked at the dance floor, then back at him. "I don't dance very well." "Neither do I," he admitted with a mischievous smile. "But let's pretend we do." He led her onto the floor, and suddenly his hand was on her waist, the other holding hers, and they were moving. Ivy stumbled once, but Tristan guided her firmly, his steps sure, his body close to hers. "Thank you," Ivy whispered as they turned, the world around them becoming a blur of lights and colors. "For what?" "For being by my side, for making me feel they're strong." Tristan pulled her slightly closer, lightly violating the appropriate distance for formal dancing, but Ivy didn't care. "Ivy," he said, his voice low and intense, "you've always been strong. I just helped you remember it." Their eyes met, and there was something in that moment, something electric, something inevitable. The air between them seemed charged, each inch of distance feeling like too much and too little at the same time. The music continued, but Ivy barely heard it. She was aware only of Tristan, the warmth of his hand on her waist, the firmness of his fingers intertwined with hers, the scent of cedar and something uniquely his, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the ballroom. "You were brilliant tonight," Tristan whispered, his lips close enough to her ear that she felt the warmth of his breath on her skin. "You gave me the strength to be brilliant," Ivy replied, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. When the music ended, they remained standing for a moment longer than appropriate, reluctant to break the connection. Then, slowly, Tristan led her off the floor, his hand never leaving her waist, as if he couldn't bear to lose contact. And that night, as they returned to Montgomery Hall, Ivy looked out the carriage window at the illuminated streets of London and realized something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the terrified girl who hid scars. She was becoming a woman who knew her own worth, and the man sitting beside her, the husband she hadn't chosen but who had chosen to respect her, had been an essential part of that transformation. The weeks following the ball brought a subtle but undeniable shift in the dynamic between Ivy and Tristan. It was as if the confrontation with her father had removed an invisible barrier, allowing something new to blossom in the space that before was occupied only by cautious respect and polite distance. Now there were touches, not accidental or formal touches, but deliberate ones. Tristan's hand resting on the small of her back when they walked together through the gardens, his fingers brushing hers when he handed her a cup of tea, the way he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her skin for a second longer than necessary. And there were looks that Ivy caught when she raised her eyes from a book and found Tristan watching her from the library doorway, an expression on his face she still couldn't fully name. Desire, yes, but also something deeper. Tenderness, perhaps, or something dangerously close to devotion. Ivy also found herself watching him, The way his brow furrowed when he was focused on business correspondence. The way he smiled, a genuine smile, not the polite one he used in society, when she said something that amused him. The strong line of his jaw, the rebellious strands of dark blonde hair that fell over his forehead when he forgot to comb them properly. It was dangerous, this new territory they were navigating, and exciting, and terrifying. It was Margaret who suggested Ivy become more actively involved in social work. "You have a sharp mind," she had said during one of her visits, "and a unique perspective. Use them. There are women who need the voice of someone who understands what they're going through." And so Ivy began attending meetings of the Committee for Aid to Disadvantaged Women, first just observing, then gradually contributing ideas. She discovered she had a talent for organization, for seeing solutions where others saw only problems. Tristan supported her discreetly, providing funds when necessary, using his influence to open doors, but always making it clear that the work and credit were hers. He came to meetings occasionally, sitting at the back of the room, and Ivy could feel his eyes on her when she spoke, could feel the pride emanating from him like warmth. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting where Ivy had presented a detailed plan to expand the shelter, she returned to Montgomery Hall, feeling energized and alive, in a way she had never experienced before. Tristan was waiting in the sitting room, a glass of cognac in hand, still dressed in the vest and trousers of his work attire, his tie loosened around his neck in a way that was inadvertently attractive. "How did it go?" he asked, standing as she entered. "It was incredible," Ivy said, unable to contain the smile that lit up her face. "They approved my proposal. We're going to start expanding the shelter next month." Tristan's expression softened, and he crossed the room in long strides, stopping in front of her. "Ivy, that's magnificent. You're doing something extraordinary. I couldn't do it without your support," she said sincerely. "No." Tristan shook his head, his eyes fixed on hers. "This is all you. Your vision, your passion, your strength. I have the privilege of witnessing it." There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, that made Ivy's heart race. They were close, closer than they should be for casual conversation. She could feel the warmth emanating from his body, could see the pulse in his neck, could catch the familiar scent of cedar mixed with something slightly woody from the cognac. "Tristan," she whispered, not quite sure what she wanted to say, only knowing she needed to say his name. Something changed in his eyes. They darkened, intensified. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and then his fingers touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with a delicacy that contrasted with the obvious strength in his hands. "You're extraordinary," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do you know that?" Ivy couldn't answer. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. Her eyes fell to his lips and she couldn't help it, and when she looked up again, she saw he had noticed. "Ivy," Tristan said, his voice barely above a whisper, laden with something that sounded like painful restraint. "If you don't want this, you need to tell me now, because I'm losing my ability to control myself around you." "And what if I don't want you to control yourself?" The words came out before Ivy could stop them, bold and honest and revealing everything she'd been feeling. Tristan closed his eyes for a moment, as if fighting against himself. "Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, I don't know if I'll be able to stop." "Then don't stop," Ivy whispered, and that was all he needed to hear. Tristan closed the distance between them in one fluid movement, one hand sliding to the nape of her neck, fingers threading through her hair, the other landing on her waist, pulling her closer. And then his lips met hers. The kiss was nothing like Ivy expected. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was intense, consuming, as if he had been holding this back for weeks and finally could let go. His lips moved against hers with a hunger that made her tremble, and when his tongue traced the outline of her lower lip, she gasped, and he took the moment to deepen the kiss. Ivy clutched at his shoulders, needing something to hold on to as the world spun. She had never been kissed like this, with desire, yes, but also with reverence, as if she were something precious, and he was afraid of breaking her but unable to resist. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, foreheads pressed together, hearts beating in irregular synchrony. "My God," Tristan murmured, his lips brushing hers as he spoke. "I've wanted to do that for weeks." "Why didn't you?" Ivy asked, her voice trembling. "Because I promised to respect your boundaries, and I didn't know if you wanted me that way." Ivy pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "I do," she said, each word deliberate and true. "I want you. In every way." Something passed through Tristan's eyes, relief, desire, and something deeper that neither was ready to name yet. "Still," he said, his hands moving to hold her face tenderly, "we'll go slow. At your pace. Always at your pace." "And what if my pace is now?" Ivy asked boldly. Tristan let out a low, husky laugh that sent shivers down her spine. "Then now, but not here. Not in a sitting room where any servant could walk in." He took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, and guided her out of the room, through Montgomery Hall's silent corridors. Ivy followed, her heart pounding wildly, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness making her hands shake. They stopped in front of her bedroom door. Tristan turned to face her, his eyes dark with desire, but also serious. "Last chance to change your mind," he said. "No judgment, no resentment. We can stop now and—" Ivy silenced him by placing a finger on his lips. "I don't want to stop," she said firmly. Then, gathering all her courage, she opened the door and entered, pulling him with her. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The room was bathed in the silvery moonlight streaming through the windows, creating soft shadows that made everything more intimate, more surreal. Ivy turned to face Tristan and saw in him the same mixture of desire and nervousness she felt. "Ivy," he said, approaching slowly, as if she were something wild that might flee. "I need you to know I've never done this. Not like this. Not with someone who matters." The words touched her deeply. She had never done this either, had never chosen to be with someone, had never wanted to be touched. But she wanted it now. Wanted him. "Then let's learn together," she echoed the words he had said weeks ago when they were just beginning this unlikely journey. Tristan smiled, that genuine smile she loved, and closed the distance between them. This time the kiss was softer, slower, exploring rather than devouring. His hands traced the contours of her body over her dress, memorizing every curve, and Ivy allowed herself to melt against him. She felt his fingers find the buttons at the back of her dress, and he paused, pulling back enough to meet her eyes. "May I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes," she whispered. One button came loose, then another, and another, each released with deliberate care as if it were a sacred ritual. When the dress finally slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor in a whisper of fabric, Ivy stood there in only her slip, feeling vulnerable but not afraid. Tristan's eyes traveled over her body, and she saw in them not raw lust but admiration, reverence. "Beautiful," he murmured. "Absolutely beautiful." His hand reached out, fingers tracing the outline of her shoulder, where one of the scars was visible beneath the thin fabric of the slip. Ivy tensed instinctively, but Tristan leaned in and kissed the mark softly, his lips like a silent promise against her skin. "Every part of you," he whispered against her skin, "is perfect." Tears burned Ivy's eyes, not from sadness but from something more powerful, from being seen, from being accepted, from being desired not despite her scars, but with them. Her own hands moved to his vest, fingers clumsy with the buttons, and Tristan laughed softly, helping her remove it, then his shirt, until he stood before her bare-chested, muscles defined by the moonlight. Ivy reached out hesitantly, her fingers touching his warm skin, feeling the muscles contract beneath her touch. She could feel his heart beating hard under her palm, as fast as hers. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Me too," Tristan confessed, and somehow that made everything better, more real, more theirs. He gently guided her to the bed, and they lay down together, bodies fitting in ways that felt both new and familiar. And there, in the silvery moonlight, with whispered words and touches that were both tentative and revealing, they found each other. It wasn't perfect. It was awkward at moments, filled with nervous breaths and soft laughter when something didn't work exactly as planned. But it was theirs, honest and real and loaded with emotions neither was fully ready to name. And when they finally lay intertwined, hearts calming, skin against skin, Tristan kissed her forehead, his fingers drawing lazy circles on her bare skin. "I never thought love could be like this," Ivy confessed in the darkness, the word love escaping before she could stop it. Tristan froze for a second, then held her tighter against him. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But with you everything makes sense." And in that moment Ivy knew. She had fallen in love with her husband, and he, perhaps, had fallen in love with her too. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Ivy's room, creating golden stripes that danced across the white sheets where she and Tristan were still entwined. Ivy woke slowly, conscious first of the warmth that came not just from the sun's rays but from the solid body pressed against her back, from the heavy arm wrapped around her waist, from the rhythmic breathing brushing her neck. Tristan. Her husband was in her bed, and for the first time since they married, it didn't feel wrong or frightening. It felt right. Ivy turned carefully, trying not to wake him, and found herself face to face with him. In sleep, Tristan looked different, younger, more vulnerable. The tension lines that usually marked his forehead were softened, his lips slightly parted, strands of dark blonde hair falling messily over his eyes. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble that had grown overnight. It was intimate in a way that made her feel simultaneously bold and shy. Tristan's eyes opened, focusing on her immediately, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. A smile she'd never seen before, completely unguarded and genuine. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Ivy replied, feeling her cheeks flush under the intensity of his gaze. His hand moved to cover hers on his face, intertwining their fingers and bringing them to his lips to kiss them softly. "You're blushing," he observed, amusement dancing in his eyes. I'm not used to waking up with someone in my bed," she admitted. "Neither am I," Tristan said, pulling her closer, so their bodies were pressed together under the sheets. "But I could get used to this." Ivy could feel every inch of him against her, and awareness of it sent a wave of heat through her body. The previous night had been transformative, but it had also been just the beginning, she realized now. There was so much more to discover, to explore, to feel. As if reading her thoughts, Tristan leaned in and kissed her. Not with last night's urgency, but with a deliberate slowness that was somehow even more intense. His lips moved against hers with purpose, exploring, savoring, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second. Ivy melted into the kiss, her hands sliding over his bare chest, feeling muscles contract beneath her touch. She loved this, the power to make his body react, to know she affected him as much as he affected her. Tristan's hand traced the curve of her waist, sliding beneath the slip she'd worn after the previous night, and Ivy gasped against his lips when his fingers found bare skin. "Is this okay?" he asked, pulling back enough to meet her eyes, checking, always checking. "Yes," Ivy whispered. "More than okay." That was all he needed to hear. His hands became bolder, exploring the curves of her body with a reverence that made Ivy feel worshipped. When he pulled the slip over her head, removing it completely, she felt no shame or fear, only desire. He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes traveling over every inch of her exposed skin, including the scars she had always hidden, and in his gaze there was no revulsion or pity, only pure admiration. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Tristan said, his voice laden with emotion that went far beyond physical desire. Then he leaned down and began kissing her body. Not hurriedly, but methodically, as if mapping every inch of her. His lips traced the curve of her neck, the line of her collarbone, the valley between her breasts. And when he reached the scars on her shoulders, he kissed them with the same attention, perhaps even more, as if trying to heal every old wound with his mouth. "Tristan," Ivy sighed, her fingers burying themselves in his hair, holding him closer even as the intensity of what she was feeling frightened her. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against her skin, his lips moving lower, kissing the space between her breasts, the curve of her stomach. tell me how to make you feel good." "I don't know," Ivy admitted, her voice trembling. No one ever asked." Tristan raised his head, his eyes meeting hers, and there was something in them, a mixture of desire and tenderness, that made her heart tighten. "Then let's find out together," he said. And he did. With patience and attention, he learned her body. What made her sigh? What made her gasp? What made her arch against him? And Ivy in turn explored his, discovering she liked the way he groaned when she kissed a certain spot on his neck. How his muscles tensed when she lightly dragged her nails down his back. It was a dance, clumsy at times, but beautiful in its honesty. When Tristan finally positioned himself above her, propping himself on his elbows so as not to crush her, his eyes met hers once more. "Are you sure?" he asked, even though they both knew the answer. "Yes," Ivy said, pulling him closer. "I want you. I choose you." The words meant more than just physical consent. They were an emotional choice, a declaration that this, them, was real, and wanted, and chosen. Tristan entered her slowly, carefully, his eyes never leaving hers, watching every expression, every breath, making sure everything was okay. And when they were completely joined, he paused, allowing her to adjust, his forehead pressed against hers. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "Yes," Ivy answered, and it was true. There was no pain this time, just the overwhelming feeling of connection, of intimacy, of two bodies becoming one. They moved together in a rhythm that was uniquely theirs, not rushed, but deep, each movement deliberate and meaningful. Tristan kissed her as he moved, his lips capturing every moan that escaped her, and Ivy clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning. "You're so beautiful like this," Tristan murmured against her lips, his voice hoarse. "So perfect, so mine." "Yours," Ivy repeated, and for the first time in her life, belonging to someone didn't feel like imprisonment. It felt like liberation. The tension built between them, growing in waves that became increasingly intense until Ivy felt something inside her break. Not shattering, but releasing, like a dam giving way under pressure. She cried out Tristan's name, her body arching against his, and he followed moments later, burying his face in her neck, his body trembling with the force of his release. They stayed like that for a long moment, hearts beating in frantic synchrony, bodies still entwined, breathing gradually calming. Tristan rolled to the side, pulling her with him so she lay on his chest, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her bare back. "That was—" Ivy began, but had no words. "Yes," Tristan agreed, kissing the top of her head. It was. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, just existing in each other's space, until Ivy finally gathered the courage to say what was in her heart. "Tristan," she said softly, raising her head to look at him, "I think I'm falling in love with you." She expected to see surprise, maybe discomfort. Instead, she saw relief. "Thank God," he said, letting out a laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "Because I'm already completely in love with you, and it was starting to get hard to hide it." Tears burned Ivy's eyes, happy tears this time. "You are?" "Yes," Tristan said firmly, turning her so she lay beside him, their faces inches apart. "I fell in love with the brave woman who stood up to her father, with the intelligent woman who's changing lives through her work, with the kind woman who treats every servant with respect, with the beautiful woman who lets me touch her, know her, love her." He paused, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "I fell in love with you, Ivy. All of you. And I don't regret a single moment." "Neither do I," Ivy whispered, kissing him softly. "This marriage was arranged, but the love was our choice." "The best choice I ever made," Tristan agreed. They made love again, slower this time, savoring every touch, every kiss, every moment. And when they finally got up hours later to face the day, both knew something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just husband and wife by obligation. They were partners, they were lovers, they were souls who had chosen each other against all odds. And nothing, not society, not family, not the past, could take that away from them. The months following the night when Ivy and Tristan finally admitted their feelings were transformative in a way neither could have predicted. What had begun as an arranged marriage, cold and silent, had blossomed into a partnership that went far beyond romantic love. It was mutual respect, admiration, and a genuine desire to see each other flourish. Ivy discovered that loving Tristan didn't mean losing herself in him. On the contrary, his love made her stronger, bolder, more herself. One Tuesday morning, Ivy was in the office Tristan had insisted on preparing for her. A bright room on the second floor overlooking the gardens, an elegant mahogany desk, shelves filled with books on administration, economics and women's rights, and a comfortable armchair near the window where she liked to think. She was reviewing plans for the new project she'd proposed to the committee. An education program for low-income women that would teach not just traditional domestic skills, but also literacy, basic mathematics, and even simple bookkeeping. Tools that would give them real independence. "You're frowning," Tristan's voice came from the doorway. "That means you're either deeply focused or something's wrong." Ivy looked up and smiled at seeing him leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with that expression she'd learned to recognize. Affection mixed with admiration. "A bit of both," she admitted. "The numbers are working, but I'm worried the committee will find the curriculum too radical." Tristan entered the office, walking until he stood behind her chair. He leaned down, his hands resting on her shoulders, and Ivy instinctively leaned into his touch, feeling the tension in her muscles begin to dissolve. "You're teaching women to be independent," he said, his hands beginning to gently massage her shoulders. "That will always be considered radical by people who prefer the status quo, but that's exactly why it needs to be done. What if they reject it? Then you find another way. You always do." He leaned closer, his lips brushing her ear. "You're the most determined woman I know, and also the smartest. They'd be fools to reject you." Ivy turned her head, capturing his lips in a brief but sweet kiss. "Thank you for believing in me." "Always," Tristan replied, straightening up. "Actually, I came here for a reason. I want to show you something." Curious, Ivy followed Tristan through Montgomery Hall's corridors until they reached a part of the house she rarely visited, the hallway leading to the estate's administrative offices. Tristan stopped before a double oak door, his hands on the handles, and turned to her with a smile that seemed simultaneously nervous and excited. "Ready?" he asked. "For what?" "You'll see." He opened the doors, revealing a large and elegantly furnished office. But it wasn't just any office. It was clearly a space prepared to function as an organization's headquarters. There were several desks, document files, empty shelves waiting to be filled, and a meeting table large enough to accommodate 10 people. "What is this?" Ivy asked, entering slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. "It's yours," Tristan said simply. "Your space, for your foundation." Ivy turned sharply to face him. "My foundation?" "Yes." Tristan walked to her, taking her hands in his. "Ivy, the work you're doing is too important to depend on decisions from committees that may or may not support you. You need complete autonomy. So I thought, why not create your own foundation? A place where you can implement your ideas without needing anyone's approval but your own." Ivy looked at him, feeling emotion build in her throat. "Tristan, this is too much. I can't accept—" "It's not too much," he interrupted gently. "And it's not charity. It's an investment. In you, in your work, in all the women you're going to help." He paused, squeezing her hands. "Besides, I've already established the foundation legally. You're the executive director. I'm just a silent donor, and if you'll allow it, an occasional advisor." Tears burned Ivy's eyes. No one had ever believed in her like this. No one had ever given her not just encouragement, but real tools to achieve her dreams. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll accept. Say you'll build something incredible here." Tristan smiled, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "And maybe let me help occasionally because I quite enjoy working alongside you." "Yes," Ivy said, laughing through the tears. "Yes, I accept, and yes, you can help. We're partners after all." "Partners," Tristan repeated, pulling her into a tight embrace. "In everything." In the following weeks, Ivy dove into the work of establishing the Education and Freedom Foundation, a name she chose carefully because it captured exactly what she wanted to achieve. With Tristan's financial support and Margaret's connections, She managed to recruit qualified teachers, rent an appropriate building in central London, and begin promoting the program. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of women enrolled in the first weeks, some young and eager to learn, others older who had spent their lives without formal education and saw this as a second chance. Tristan often accompanied her to foundation meetings, sitting discreetly at the back of the room while Ivy chaired discussions, made decisions, solved problems. And in the evenings when they returned to Montgomery Hall, they dined together, not at opposite ends of the long, formal table, but side by side at the smaller table in the sitting room where they could talk easily. "How was the first day of classes?" Tristan asked one evening, pouring wine for both of them. "Amazing," Ivy said, her face lighting up. "You should have seen it, Tristan. There was a woman, Sarah, who's 42 years old and had never held a pen before. And today she wrote her name for the first time. She cried. We all cried." Tristan's expression softened. "You're changing lives, Ivy. Really changing them." "We're changing lives," she corrected. "I couldn't do this without you." "You could," Tristan gently disagreed, "but I have the privilege of being by your side while you do." They discussed ideas together constantly now, Tristan offering business perspectives, Ivy bringing the human element he sometimes missed. They were complementary in ways neither had anticipated. One evening, after a particularly productive dinner where they'd planned the Foundation's expansion to other cities, Ivy found herself just watching Tristan as he read correspondence near the fireplace. He looked up, catching her staring, and smiled. "What is it?" "I'm just grateful," Ivy said. "For you, for this, for everything we've become." Tristan set the papers aside and extended his hand. Ivy took it, allowing him to pull her from the sofa where she was sitting onto his lap. She settled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, feeling his arms close around her. "You know what I realized?" Tristan said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. "What? When we got married, I thought I was losing my freedom, being forced into a life I hadn't chosen." He paused, kissing the top of her head. "But you didn't take away my freedom. You freed me. From expectations, from loneliness, from a life that was empty of real meaning." Ivy raised her head to look at him, her eyes shining. "You did the same for me. You showed me I could be more than my past, more than my scars. You always were more," Tristan said firmly. "I just helped you remember." They kissed, a slow, deep kiss that quickly intensified, as it always did between them. Tristan lifted her from the sofa, carrying her upstairs to their bedroom, no longer separate rooms but a shared space that was unmistakably theirs. And there, in the intimacy of their room, they made love with the familiarity of people who knew each other's bodies completely, but also with passion that had never diminished. Each touch was a promise, each kiss a declaration, each shared moment a celebration of having found each other against all odds. Afterward, lying intertwined, Tristan traced the scars on her back with gentle fingers, something he did frequently now, as if constantly reminding her they didn't define her. "You're the best part of me, Ivy," he said in the darkness, "and I choose you. Every day, for every reason, I choose you." Ivy turned to face him, their eyes meeting in the dim light. "And I choose you. Not because a contract binds us, but because my heart knows no other choice." "We made something beautiful from this arranged marriage, didn't we?" Tristan observed, a smile touching his lips. "Yes," Ivy agreed, kissing him softly. "We did." And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, both knew they had created something rare, a love that hadn't been given to them, but that they had built together brick by brick, choice by choice, day after day. A love that was entirely theirs. 2 years had passed since that cold, silent wedding night, and Montgomery Hall had transformed into something neither could have imagined. Not just a house, but a home. A place where love wasn't just felt, but lived in every shared moment, every decision made together, every dream built side by side. It was a spring morning, and Ivy was in the rose garden she had personally redesigned, transforming it from a formal and rigid space into something wilder and freer, exactly as she herself had become. She wore a simple white cotton dress, her hair loose and falling in waves over her shoulders, and there was dirt under her nails from planting new seedlings. "You're radiant," Tristan's voice came from behind her, carrying that tone of admiration that still made her blush even after so much time together. Ivy turned, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand, and smiled at seeing him walking toward her. He had abandoned his formal vest, wearing only a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms bronzed by the sun. His hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and there was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there when they first met. "So are you," she replied, standing up and wiping the dirt from her hands on her apron. "Though you're more appropriately dressed to avoid getting dirty." Tristan pulled her into his arms, not caring about the dirt or the smell of roses and soil that permeated her skin. "I don't mind getting dirty," he murmured, kissing her softly. "Especially if it means being close to you." Ivy laughed against his lips, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You've become incorrigibly romantic." "Only with you," he said, his blue eyes sparkling with humor and something deeper. "Only always with you." They walked hand in hand back to the house where Martha was waiting with news. "Milady, correspondence has arrived from the Foundation. It looks important." Ivy took the thick envelope, immediately recognizing the official seal. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation, as she opened it and read the contents. "Tristan," she said, her voice filled with controlled emotion, They approved it." "Approved what?" he asked, though he already knew from the expression on her face. "The national expansion. The Education and Freedom Foundation is going to open branches in Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Edinburgh. We'll be able to reach hundreds, no, thousands, of women." Tears shone in her eyes. "Tristan, this is real. We're really making a difference." Tristan pulled her into a tight embrace, his own voice thick with emotion. "You're making a difference. This is all you, Ivy. Your vision, your passion, your tireless work." "Our work," she corrected, as she always did. "We're partners in this." That evening, they organized an intimate dinner to celebrate. Just the two of them, Margaret and some of the women who had been instrumental in the Foundation's success. It was a small but meaningful group, gathered around the table, where Ivy and Tristan had shared so many life-changing conversations. Margaret raised her wine glass, her eyes shining with genuine pride. "A toast," she said, her voice clear and strong, "to my daughter-in-law, who took her pain and transformed it into purpose, who took her scars and transformed them into strength, and who reminds me every day that surviving isn't enough. We must flourish." "To Ivy," everyone repeated, raising their glasses. Ivy felt tears burn her eyes, happy tears of fulfillment, of gratitude for having found not just love but also her place in the world. After dinner, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, Ivy and Tristan went up to their room, the space that had become their sanctuary, where they were just Ivy and Tristan, without titles or expectations, just two people who loved each other deeply. Tristan helped her unbutton her dress, his fingers working the small buttons with the practice of someone who had done this hundreds of times. But each time still felt special, still carried that electric current of anticipation. When the dress slipped from her shoulders, revealing skin marked by scars that were no longer sources of shame but symbols of survival, Tristan kissed them as he always did, with reverence, with love, with the silent promise that she was perfect exactly as she was. "I'll never get tired of this," Ivy whispered as he guided her to the bed. "Of what?" Tristan asked, lying down beside her, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. "Of you touching me like I'm precious. Of you looking at me like I'm extraordinary. Of you loving me like I'm enough." Tristan propped himself up on one elbow, looking at her with an intensity that still stole her breath. "Ivy, you're not enough. You're everything. You're the first thing I think of when I wake up and the last before I sleep. You're my partner, my confidant, my love, my best friend. You transformed my life from something I was just surviving into something worth living." "You did the same for me," Ivy said, pulling him closer. "You gave me freedom when I expected imprisonment. You gave me respect when I expected control. You gave me love when I didn't even know it was something I deserved." They made love that night, not with the nervous urgency of the early days, nor with the desperate passion of new lovers, but with the deep intimacy of two people who knew every inch of each other's body, mind, and soul. It was slow and deep, full of whispers and touches that were both familiar and always new. Afterward, lying intertwined, Ivy traced the line of Tristan's jaw with lazy fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Being forced to marry me?" Tristan captured her hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing each finger. "Never. Not for a second. That arranged marriage was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it brought me you. Even though it wasn't your choice." "Ah, but it was." He smiled, that smile that was only hers. "Maybe I didn't choose the marriage, but I chose to love you. I chose to respect you. I chose to build a life with you. Those were the choices that mattered. And I'd make them all again without hesitation." Ivy felt her heart overflow. "Me too." They fell asleep like that. Bodies intertwined, hearts beating in synchrony. Two survivors who had found not just refuge in each other, but transformation. The months that followed brought more growth, more change, more life. The Education and Freedom Foundation expanded as planned, touching the lives of thousands of women who, like Ivy, had thought their circumstances defined them forever. Ivy traveled frequently to oversee the new branches, and Tristan always accompanied her when possible, both working side by side, not just as husband and wife, but as true partners in a shared mission. At one of the Foundation's events, a young woman approached Ivy, tears in her eyes. "Lady Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to thank you. Before I found this place, I thought my life was over. But you showed me I can start again, that my scars don't define me." Ivy held the young woman's hands, recognizing in her the girl she herself had been. "No," she said gently, "your scars don't define you, but they're part of your story, and your story is just beginning." When Ivy recounted the encounter to Tristan that night, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her hair. "Do you know what you did?" he said. "You took your pain and transformed it into healing for others. That's extraordinary, Ivy." "We did that," she corrected once more. "Together." "Together," he agreed. "Always together." And it was true. They were a unit now, not because a contract obligated them, but because they had chosen every day to build something beautiful from what had begun as obligation. On a winter evening, exactly 3 years after their wedding, Ivy and Tristan stood on the veranda of Montgomery Hall, watching snow fall softly over the gardens. She was wrapped in his embrace, her back pressed against his chest, his arms encircling her protectively. "Are you happy?" Tristan asked, his cheek resting against the top of her head. Ivy thought about the question, really thought about it, and realized that yes, she was happy. Not in the naive, uncomplicated way that romantic stories promised, but in a deep and real way. She had purpose, she had love, she had freedom. She had a partner who saw her, really saw her, and loved her, not despite her imperfections, but including all of them. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm happy. Truly happy." "Me too," Tristan whispered, kissing her neck softly. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up. For giving me a chance. For showing me what real love looks like." Ivy turned in his arms, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Thank you for seeing me beyond the scars," she whispered against his lips. "I never saw scars," Tristan replied, echoing words he had said on their first night together. "Only your strength, only your beauty, only you." And there, under the softly falling snow, 2 survivors who had become victors, who had transformed an arranged marriage into a true and rare love, stood embraced. Their scars were still there, physical and emotional, but they no longer defined them. They had chosen to flourish, and together they would continue flourishing, every day, forever. In the end, Ivy and Tristan proved that true love isn't born from perfect choices, but from daily courage. They took a marriage that should have been just a cold contract and transformed it into something sacred, not because it was easy, but because they decided to see each other, really see. Ivy learned that her scars weren't weakness, but testimony to everything she survived. And Tristan discovered that the greatest power isn't in controlling, but in setting free. Together, they built a life where love doesn't suffocate, but liberates. Where wounds from the past don't dictate the future. And where 2 strangers forced to the altar became souls who chose each other, every day in every way. Because sometimes the truest love is the one we don't seek, but choose to build, brick by brick, choice by choice, scar by scar. And perhaps that's the most beautiful lesson of all. It doesn't matter how we begin. What matters is who we decide to become alongside the one we love. What about you? Have you ever had to transform something that seemed impossible into something extraordinary? Have you ever had to choose to love when it would have been easier to give up? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member for early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was truly worth listening to, please also click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing stories that move people. Comment below where you're listening from. We love knowing our stories travel the world, touching hearts.